Let's take a look at corn markets in Malawi as a classic example of failed policy. Malawi is a landlocked country in Central Africa, and it's one of the very poorest nations in the world, with a per capita income of only about $800. Maize, or corn, is extremely important to the economy of Malawi. It accounts for 60% of their growing land, and more importantly, corn accounts for about 70% of the calories consumed. So if there's a bad corn harvest, it means some very serious problems for food supply in Malawi. The price of corn in Malawi is at its lowest during harvest time, which is basically April through June, and here you see the price being quite low, and the price of corn is at its highest at around February, which is right before the harvest, and that gap is about 60%. So the price of corn within a year in Malawi is extremely volatile. Ideally, what one would like is to have more trade of corn, so when the price of corn is high, corn supply comes in from other countries or perhaps from stored inventories, and that this graph is smoothed out somewhat. But that's not the case, and thus there is a risk, and especially high risk, of corn hardship in Malawi in those months when the corn prices are higher. In Malawi, only about 15% of the corn supply is traded. For the most part, it is grown by farmers and then consumed, but markets and institutions for trade are relatively weak in Malawi. In recent times, there have been some corn price spikes in Malawi, due mostly to a restricted supply and bad harvests. The policy response to these corn price spikes, for the most part, has been counterproductive. For instance, the Malawian government has instituted price controls on corn, but when the government artificially holds down the price of corn, there's then much less of an incentive to bring corn to market, and in the longer run, there's less of an incentive to grow corn for the next time around. The Malawi government has also at times placed export bans on corn. The rationale here is to prevent corn from leaving the country, and maybe in the short run this means more corn in the country, but again we need to consider the medium and long-term response, and that is when farmers know they cannot export corn in difficult times, they are less likely to grow corn in the first place. What makes even less sense are import bans on corn. The Malawian government has done those too. And finally, the Malawian government at times has gone so far as to try to shut down trading in corn altogether. Again, simple economics will tell you this will make a corn supply crisis much worse rather than better. Fortunately, to some extent, there are black markets in Malawi, and trade in corn has continued even when governments have tried to shut it down. The overall result of these policies is that plentiful corn in Malawi has been harder to come by. There's a very good paper by Ellis and Manda, and they outline what is a common cycle of events for corn markets and corn policy in Malawi. It's a pretty depressing story, but let's just run through it. Starting at the beginning, we see that very often prices fall at harvest time less than average. That means there's going to be a less good than average corn crop during the harvest. That also means that after the harvest, prices rise by an especially large degree because corn is especially scarce. The government doesn't recognize that there's a problem, but typically what they do is they officially declare that there's a fully supplied market so that the government looks good. Later on, it turns out that corn prices were higher than the government had wanted them to be, and the government comes along and it accuses traders of hoarding corn and blames the problem on the traders. The government also attacks speculators or maybe institutes legal penalties against them. Of course, what speculators are doing is trying to allocate corn to those points in time when the price of corn is highest, which means the demand for corn is highest, so speculators even out corn price movements over time, but commonly they're attacked by governments for being a major source of the problem. State marketing bodies then intervene and buy up a lot of the supply of corn. That makes corn even more scarce on the market, and then government in Malawi makes a further mistake by trying to ban private trade in corn. That's just about every economic policy mistake imaginable in that quick sequence. But we're not done. Let's continue. The government may then reinstate a monopoly of state marketing bodies on the grounds that there's some kind of crisis in the corn market, but the state marketing bodies don't do a good job of supplying more corn. It's then the case that the government will have rationing. There will be sales from dwindling public stocks, which are handed out and using coupons and other legal means rather than letting markets allocate the corn. During all this time, there's a demand for greater imports, typically from neighboring African nations, and after a delay of months, some of those imports finally arrive, or they are at least ordered, but the imports on average arrive late. That's because Malawi has bad procurement policies, and also because the infrastructure and transportation are very bad, and sometimes by the time the imports have arrived, they arrive at exactly the same point in time when the next harvest is coming along, which is when the imports are needed least, and that makes the price of corn for a while especially low. But one thing Malawi could do to have better corn policy is simply make it easier for imports to arrive more quickly rather than banning and taxing and trying to limit imports through the force of law. That's all a mouthful, but basically it is a story of hunger, and it is a story of hunger because of bad and misguided policies. These are not policies which are defended by any serious economists, but they're a good example of how, around the world, government policies toward agriculture are often quite irrational. The analysis of this video has drawn on an excellent paper by Frank Ellis and Elizabeth Manda, Seasonal Food Crises and Policy Responses, a narrative account of 3 food security crises in Malawi, available online.